So welcome everyone to session 3 of Diets and Our Demons, our Networker webinar. My name is Rich Simon. I'm the editor of Psychotherapy Networker, and I'm your host for this series. So we've gotten off to a very interesting and very engaged start. There's been a lot of, there's something about this whole topic of weight loss and diets that's of great both professional and personal interest for many of us. And we've, first 2 sessions, we've explored a number of different perspectives, 2 different perspectives on this. One, Judith Motz started us off talking about attuned eating. And then last session, Judith Beck talked about applying the CBT model to dieting and weight loss. And we're very fortunate in our 3rd session to have somebody with a very varied background of both as both a psychotherapist and as somebody who is has advanced degrees in physiology and exercise and also in nutrition. So before I introduce her, let me just do one technical thing, just a reminder to those of you, if your image is not full screen on your computer right now, just click the 2 overlapping rectangles right below the slide that is on the template, the logo for this series, and you'll move to full size and be able to read the slides and be able to take full advantage of the materials that will be presented to you. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Linda Bacon, who is coming to us with this very varied background. Linda, good afternoon.
Good
there
to
she
see
is.
you again, Rich.
Okay. So, Linda, let's just get right into it, because you bring a range of knowledge and of training to your work. You began as a psychotherapist who was specializing in eating disorders and body image, and then you've gotten degrees in exercise physiology and physiology and nutrition. So tell us a little bit about this. What in terms of your initial experience as a therapist, what motivated you to go out and to get this additional training?
Well, I'd say before I even got my training as a psychotherapist, it's important to note my motivation there.
Okay.
And basically, I got involved in this field to save myself. Eating and weight were such difficult issues for me that I wanted to explore them further. And at the time, we always had this sense that when people had weight concerns, it was a psychological issue. And that's why I suppose my first degree was getting a master's in psychotherapy. And I did, in fact, learn a lot about how people approach food through psychotherapy, and I worked for years as a therapist specializing with eating disorders and body image. But the more I worked in the field, the more I realized that weight control issues were much broader than psychological difficulties. And so I felt like to understand the issue more, I had to look at it from the perspective of different disciplines, which is why I next went to exercise, because there's always this image that you can control weight either through your attitude towards food and what you eat, or through exercise, so I thought I would do that mode next. But what I realized after both of these degrees was that we can't have the kind of control that we like to believe we do just through looking at how we choose foods and what kind of exercise we get, that there was a lot more that was complicated in this picture, which is why I eventually went on to get a PhD and also do some research in physiology and nutrition and bring it all together to look at the whole big topic of weight regulation.
Okay, so one of the hallmarks of your work, as I've come to learn about it, is your belief that that therapists, most of us in this culture, labor under a series of myths about weight and weight loss and health. And so let's start our discussion today with that. So talk to us about what you think of as these myths that have such an impact on our attitudes and our practices as therapists and just the way so many of us live our lives.
Sure, I'd be happy to. But let me just ask a technical question because I'm having a little trouble getting my slides. There we go. Looks like
okay.
you.
Okay, is that helping you?
There we go.
Okay, good.
So, right. Okay, good. So, yeah, I'm going to be talking today about the whole health at every size model. And, yeah, you got me oriented right on track. I'd like to start by discussing some of the evidence that challenges our conventional assumptions about weight, because I think a lot of therapists don't know how to deal with the issue of weight in a therapy session because they've bought into a lot of misinformed beliefs about weight. So let's jump right into that, and then once we get a better understanding of that, then we can talk a little bit about strategies that we can work with clinically that are going to help us to work with weight.
At a practical level. Okay.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I find difficult is that a lot of people rationalize their need to control their weight by thinking about it as a health issue. And in fact, it's very surprising when we look at the scientific literature to see how much we've exaggerated our idea of weight's contribution to health. And as a physiologist, I've looked at the data very, very closely. And what we found is that the whole idea that we hear promoted all the time, that fat is killing us, that, that this next generation of kids is going to live shorter lives than their parents because of obesity concerns, and all of those ideas we have are not grounded in science. In fact, we've done a lot of research on this whole idea of weight and longevity. There's probably been about 40 epidemiologic studies that have looked at that question of how long are people living and what weight are they at. And it's amazing to see that when we look at the literature, the vast majority of the studies, I think about 36 out of 40 studies, is showing that people who are in the category we call overweight actually live longer, or at least as long, as people in the normal weight category.
Wow.
And that's also true of people that are considered to be obese, that they tend to live as long as people in the normal weight category, people at the low and moderate levels of obesity. So what we see is we've really been fed a major myth by thinking that this idea that weight is really as damaging as it is.
So when you, for example, Michelle Obama is organizing this campaign about childhood obesity, is the premise of a public health campaign like that? Is that founded on, in your view, faulty assumptions?
Very much so, and I think her campaign is really quite damaging. I think that she has wonderful intentions, a lot of really wonderful programs, but that everything is backfiring right now because she's premising it on the idea that we need to prevent childhood obesity, that I don't think it's ever valuable to target weight when weight doesn't seem to be the big issue. For some people, weight might be a side effect of poor behaviors. For other people, it might just be normal and healthy genetic variation. But what we see is that weight is not the big issue in determining health. And I've already discussed that in terms of looking at the data on longevity. We have come up with the same difficulties when we look at the data regarding illness. For example, there are so many diseases that we know are associated with obesity. Type 2 diabetes, for example, is one example. It's much more common among larger people. But what we find whenever we examine these illnesses is that there are confounding factors that cause people to both gain weight and cause disease. And that the weight is a side effect, and it's the other issues that we need to address if we want to improve health. And I also want to just reiterate the point, too, that for some people, being heavy is just normal genetic diversity. So we can never look at somebody and say, oh, you must have poor health behaviors. Some people who are fatter have excellent health behaviors and will live long, disease-free lives. Whereas others, it may be a side effect of poor choices. But the key thing is it's the health behaviors that really impact our health as opposed to the weight itself.
I see. Okay. So where does this come from then? So we have from the White House is presumably in consultation with the best medical expertise available and public health folks.
Right.
How does this kind of misguided emphasis on weight control and this equation of weight in and of itself with ill health, where does this come from? Is it simply a social prejudice?
I think so. We used to believe that the world was flat, and then we interpreted geography in that light. And then there was a point where we realized, no, that the Earth is round, and it gave us a whole new framework for understanding things. And I believe that we're at that point right now where we've been operating in a paradigm that's not grounded in science. That for so long we've had this basic belief system that fat is killing us, and we've interpreted all the research that's out there in that light, and it just confirms our suspicions. But when we start to examine the data, we realize that the data doesn't support that idea, that while it's certainly true that there are a lot of diseases that are more common among heavier people, when we actually look at it, we could find that there's a lot of things that confuse the picture, and weight's not the issue. So let me give you some examples of what I might be talking about. So there are a lot of things that I mentioned that confound the picture, and I could speak for days on this topic and give you maybe 50. I'll just narrow it down to the top 3, or to 3 of them. I don't even know that they're the top 3. Why don't we take a look first at this issue of fitness? I drew this graph from a paper that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And if you take a look at the orange dots, orange bars, what you can see is we set as a reference point longevity issues on people who are considered to be normal weight and fit. So these are the people that are exercising regularly. And then we tried to compare every other group to it. And what we found is that the people that were in the normal weight category but weren't exercising regularly had major risk for dying from an illness related to, from dying from some kind of an illness. And it didn't matter whether they were normal weight, overweight, or obese. If they were unfit, they had major disease risk. Whereas on the other hand, what we found was that overweight people, as long as they were fit, had very similar risk of death to people in the normal weight category. Same with people who are obese. So in other words, the key factor here is fitness levels, not weight. You can be fat and fit. And the fact that we tend to see an association between weight and poor health probably has more to do with fatter people not getting as much exercise as opposed to their weight itself.
I see. So we're confounding behavior, practices of healthy activity, for example, and someone's size.
Exactly.
And you're trying to show us that. So in gray here, you have a considerable. You double your risk of mortality if you're unfit. But weight in and of itself, as long as you're fit, there really is no difference.
Exactly. And you can see how important this message is for people regardless of where they fit on the size spectrum. On the one hand, we need to give the right message to the thinner people that thinness doesn't protect them, that getting exercise is also valuable for them too. When we make our message all about weight, they don't have to see this. You know, they can think that it's okay.
A false sense of safety, yeah.
Exactly. And on the other hand, we also need to support larger people in developing good exercise habits because that's going to be protective as opposed to focusing on their weight. So fitness is one example of a confounder, and again, I could go through a lot of different confounders. Another very quick example I'll give is the issue of discrimination. Boy, it's pretty tough to live in a fatter body in our culture right now. Discrimination is severe. It's now on par with discrimination based on race or gender. And we know that discrimination produces stress, and this changes your hormones and your physiology and adds to your risk for disease. So it may just be that our attitudes towards heavier people are contributing to the fact that disease is more common in that population.
Now, is there data on this? The health consequence of being discriminated against as an overweight person?
Yes, there's a lot of data that's been gathered on this. And in fact, there's one research study that I thought was so interesting that I emphasized it here. What I wrote on here is feeling fat has stronger health effects than being fat. Here's what they did in that research study. They asked people, what do you weigh right now, and what's your ideal weight?
Mm-hmm.
So from that, they could get a sense of whether people felt good at the weight that they're at or whether they felt like they were too fat. And here's what they found. If people felt like they were too fat, it didn't matter whether they were fat or not. If they felt like they were too fat, they had higher incidence of disease. Whereas the people that were fat but didn't feel fat, they had very low incidence of disease.
Okay.
So it made a really dramatic statement that the more comfortable you feel in your body, the lower the incidence of disease. So supporting people and appreciating their body, regardless of what their size is, seems to be much more valuable than getting down on people for their weight.
And people can, if they're interested, they can follow through. And these slides, for many of you, will be are going to continue to be up there. But so those are references that people can follow themselves, and if they wish to read more about these studies. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so the third example of a confounder is dieting and also weight cycling.
Mm-hmm.
What we know is that when people diet, it causes more inflammation in their arteries. And we know that inflammation is a risk factor for a lot of the diseases that we blame on obesity. So it may just be then that heavier people are getting diseases because they've been dieting, that what we've taught them to do is really problematic as opposed to the weight itself.
So take me through this, because I've read more and more, really for me, only in the last few years, about inflammation as a major factor in a range of different diseases, and I don't actually understand what inflammation are we talking about. What's this biological process? What gets inflamed and how?
It's inflammation that appears inside the blood vessels, and that could cause damage to the blood vessels, so it can then interfere with blood flow.
And
so
what is there about dieting that increases inflammation?
Well, this research isn't showing the causative process. All it's showing is that people that diet more frequently are more likely to have inflammation in their blood vessels. And there's also been separate research that looks at people that diet and then they lose weight and then they regain weight and then lose weight and regain weight. We call that weight cycling. And what they find that weight cycling also is very strongly associated with inflammation, which again is associated with disease. So again, this is another confounding factor. The fact that we see disease more commonly among heavier people in part could be blamed on dieting behaviors. So the key message here is that weight has been very, very much exaggerated as a health risk. Now, I'm not going to say it doesn't play any role in our health, but I am going to say that it's very much exaggerated. That what we find is that overweight and moderate obesity are not associated with decreased longevity, and that while it's certainly true that there are many disorders that are more common among larger people, there are confounding factors that play a larger role than weight itself. So the idea is that we need to address the behaviors that are really important as opposed to weight.
Okay.
And we've developed in medicine this whole idea of the body mass index, which is a formula that looks at somebody's weight in relation to their height. And it categorizes people based on the number that we come up as either normal weight, overweight, or obese. But what we find when we look at this data is that it's not reflective of people's health status, that there are many people that are in the overweight and obese category that live long, disease-free lives. So we can't use BMI as a measure of health. And for this reason, I really try to get away from using the words overweight and obese because they're so stigmatizing. They've become medical terms that say that somebody is sick, when in fact, just by virtue of somebody's BMI, it doesn't define them as having something pathological.
So say, for a moment, just give us a kind of a, I hope this isn't too technical a question, but what is it, so the body mass index, this is not, it's a term I've heard, I don't think I really understand it, but is this the primary scientific measure that determines whether one is officially, quote, overweight or obese? What do these terms actually refer to? Most of us, I think, in this culture, as you've been pointing out repeatedly here, feel at least slightly overweight, but that's a function of advertising. This is a function of cultural ideals or other kinds of things. So is it, from a scientific viewpoint, being overweight, being obese, can you explain to us what are these terms, or is there a clear meaning to these terms within the scientific circles?
Well, in scientific circles, body mass index right now is recognized as the most common way of defining somebody's health status.
Okay.
There are other measures like percent body fat, there's waist-hip ratio, and a lot of other things. But what I'm going to suggest is that with all of these measures, when you're trying to take a look at fat, we're measuring the wrong thing. That nothing, whether it's weight, BMI, or percent body fat, waist-hip ratio, accurately measures somebody's health. That if we want to find out about somebody's health status, we would do a lot better by asking them a little bit about their health habits, or by examining things like their blood lipid levels or blood cholesterol levels. That all of those things, other things, can give us much more important indicators of where somebody's at than pigeonholing them based on their weight.
Okay. So, and so also it seems as if this basic idea of what you're calling the calorie balance equation is in with this category of myths that many of us accept as scientific truths.
Exactly. This is yet another myth that has really gotten in the way of people being able to adopt good health behaviors. Well, first I should start out by saying the calorie balance equation itself is not a myth. Most of you are probably familiar with it. The whole idea that if you take in less calories than you spend, then you have to lose weight. Well, at this point where we do know, this is a scientific truism. I doubt you'll find many scientists that would debate this. This is now in science, it's called the first law of thermodynamics, and it really takes preeminence in the field. And while it's true, what's difficult about it is how we interpret it. So let's take that a step further. So given that we know that weight loss occurs whenever calories in are less than calories out, what's your hit, Rich? Do you think that, therefore, the way you want to manipulate that is if you want to lose weight, all you need to do is eat less or exercise more? What do you think? Does that make sense?
Some comment, I'm a good citizen of the United States. That's what I was taught. That's what I've grown up to believe. So maybe, are you going to strip me of yet another myth?
I sure am.
Okay.
Because what we find when we actually look at the scientific literature is that that's really naive. That, in fact, that's not true. That there are a lot of people that are trying to eat less and or to exercise more, and it's not resulting in sustained weight loss. So I've studied that from a scientific perspective to try to get a better understanding of why. And I can clue you in on some of the details. But first, just to reemphasize that point, we certainly know that it's a myth that if you want to lose weight, what you need to do is eat less or exercise more. That those will work in the short term. There's probably been thousands of research studies that show that they result in short-term weight loss. But any time the studies are looked at on a long-term basis, what we find is that the majority of people regain the weight. And when we start to examine the physiology, what we see is it's not just because people give up on their behaviors. We can't just blame the individual. But physiologically, they don't make sense. And here's why. The main reason is because there are a lot of different contributors to the energy balance equation other than just what you eat and how much exercise you get. So what happens is if you're trying to manipulate that, your body can decide that losing weight's not good for you, and maybe it's going to try to compensate for your behaviors. So you might be eating less, and maybe your body's going to slow down your metabolism. So maybe on some days you just have a little bit less get up and go. And then your body can make up for the fact that you've spent less calories and help you to regain the weight. And what we find is that these mechanisms that your body uses to regulate your weight are long-term mechanisms, not short-term. So you can get away with losing weight on a short-term basis for a while, and your body's not going to protest. But on a long-term basis, your body will slowly start to compensate and make up for your efforts. And we can see physiologic changes in the body, like changes, for example, in a hormone called leptin that helps you to regulate how much fat you have on your body, that show how the body is just making changes so that it'll be more efficient with its fuel and help you to preserve or to regain fat mass. So what we know is that we don't have control over the energy balance equation like we believe we do. Mm-hmm. That if your body wants to undermine what you're doing, that eventually it will. And that's why many people do regain the weight. So I like to reframe it, that it's not that dieters fail. Many dieters have really strong willpower and try really hard. And in many studies we find that people are continuing their good exercise habits or their eating habits that gave them weight loss in the first place. But there's a transition point where your body will just compensate and the compensation will be too strong. So theoretically, diets and exercise programs are just not set up to work because they're fighting your body, and your body can always just compensate for what you do.
And one of the things is that as we were doing the issue on dieting, one of the what stood out for me is I'm trying to understand the physiology of dieting, is that from the viewpoint of evolution, the body, and we're programmed to respond to food deprivation as, at a deep level, as a threat to our survival. That we've, through eons, we were putting on more weight, storing it away in times where their food was available, so we could survive periods of deprivation. So is there some connection in your work, in your view? Is there some connection between sort of this ancient programming of the human being's response to hunger and even a slight level of deprivation and this difficulty we have in losing weight long term?
Very much so. And I think that Judith Matz discussed this very well in her interview with you. That, yes, we're biologically set, many people are, to store fat efficiently. And this is a result of having experienced a lot of famines in our background. And we would have died if we couldn't store fat. And I think what's happening today is that our body doesn't know the difference between a famine and a diet. It just knows that it's getting deprived. And so when it gets deprived, it triggers mechanisms where your body wants to be more efficient at storing fat to protect you against a future famine or diet. And so it's actually resulted in weight gain.
Because it's interesting, just last week when Judith Beck was describing, one of the things she talks about in working from her model in CBT is that she encounters pretty early in the process this fear of hunger in people. And part of it, from the viewpoint of what we're talking about now, isn't so much a psychological factor, but sort of some deeply ingrained survival mechanism in the species. It isn't a reflection of individual history or quirks as much as something species-wide, perhaps.
That's interesting. Right. I think we've gotten to a very sad point now where we think of hunger as something that's bad and to be scared of. And when in fact hunger is basically our body saying, nourish me, take care of me. It's a beautiful thing to have this self-protective mechanism inside us to help in our survival. And it's sad that it's looked at as a bad thing.
So more broadly speaking, there's sort of this, one of the things about your work is really looking at this culture of weight loss and the price we pay for it. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay. So I think it's really, really important that we start to examine all of our assumptions, because by virtue of living in this culture, most people accept to some degree the idea that thinner is better and that we can control our weight through what we eat or our exercise patterns. But it becomes so important for us to recognize that that stuff is not grounded in science, and in fact, it's actually been quite damaging to people to buy into that belief system. There's a lot of side effects that happen for this. For example, we're in a culture right now where many people are preoccupied with food and weight. They feel guilty about what they eat. They feel like the stuff that they like is not stuff they're supposed to be eating, and it really gets in the way of their enjoyment of food. We also find that eating disorders are really quite rampant, that when people try these diets and don't maintain the weight loss, they feel bad about themselves and as if there's something wrong with them, results in reduced self-esteem. Certainly we know that discrimination and stigmatization is out of control around weight. We have so many judgments about what people did to get in the bodies that they have, which again are not necessarily grounded in science. And what we also know is that by virtue of trying to control their weight, it sets people up for patterns of weight cycling, and there's a lot of damage that happens from that. And I think also it's important to note that anytime we make weight the important issue, we distract people from other goals that might be more important and achievable. So for example, if somebody is exercising because they believe it's going to help them to lose weight, and then they don't see the sustained weight loss that they like, then they give up on exercise. They don't see it as beneficial or valuable because it's not giving them the weight loss goals that they were looking for. So we really have to help people to reframe it to looking at exercise as valuable and look at weight as more a neutral factor. It may or may not be a side effect, but if we make it the main goal, then if it's not achieved, it distracts people from what's really important there. So I think that we've done a lot of damage by buying into these goals, although again, it makes sense that we did in this culture because that's what we've been presented as health professionals. There's this whole idea that thinner is better, people can control their weight. And what we find is that a lot of this is really blown out of proportion.
So within your, these, I think most of us from just our general observations of the culture, we recognize that, in fact, this is the message we've been given, this is what we read in magazines, this is, I think, what most therapists believe, or at least people in my circle do. Within this world, is this the consensus? Is there a debate at this point? Is this like global warming? Is there a scientific consensus within the field of nutrition that these premises that you've been challenging are in fact not based on science, that are cultural attitudes rather than reflections of what's been studied, or is this a debate that's going on within your professional community, with the scientific community within the world of academic nutritional studies?
Well, paradigm shifts are slow to happen. I think that most scientists have been trained in the typical weight is killing us paradigm and believe very strongly in it and are very resistant to new ideas. So I would say that still that whole weight loss paradigm is the major paradigm that's happening right now. And then there are individuals that are chipping away in each of the fields and coming up with all the reinterpretations of the data that's out there that shows that it's not true. But what we find is that people in positions of power hold on to their power tightly. And it's very difficult for people to challenge their views, that it's such a deep-seated belief system that it's difficult for those of us who have ideas that are counterculture to get ourselves heard. But it's happening slowly. And I'll give you an example. The American Dietetic Association, which is the association that basically controls a lot of our ideas and beliefs about nutrition, has always pushed this whole weight loss mantra, and that weight loss is very important as a marker of health. And for years, I've been applying to go speak and present a different perspective at the American Dietetic Association, and I always got rejected. And this year was the first year that it was different. I got accepted. But what was interesting was they accepted me with a caveat. They demanded a modification of me, and I don't think they demanded a modification of anyone else who, or certainly not a modification like they asked of me. And that was that I had to go up against an anti-obesity expert who was going to give the opposite view, and I had to debate that person.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was that they still feel like everybody is resistant, and they need a chance to fight back rather than to hear a new perspective on its own.
And so and did that happen already? That debate?
No, it's going to, and I'm looking forward to an opportunity because I think that it is a really great forum to be able to see how the differences between the two paradigms.
And so you're savvy in your field, and you've you know this literature. What will this other, as you're presenting it to us, at least from my viewpoint, you're making a very persuasive case, especially these charts where you're deconfounding weight and fitness level. What is it that people who are on the other side of this debate, what is it? Do they dispute those findings and the impact of making that discrimination?
Well, what they will probably do is they will take the weight and health data, and they'll take hundreds and hundreds of studies that are showing that there's a relationship between weight and health, and say that that's causative, that therefore weight is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And what my whole intent is to reinterpret the data that they're doing, that the data that they're looking at, that those same hundreds of studies that they say prove that weight is the problem can be interpreted in a very different way. We can start to look at what the underlying factors might be, for example, that confound it.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, I got to say that I can't understand how they can make a strong argument, that it's all about interpretation of data, and their interpretation isn't scientific, that they have to assume that fat is bad in order to get to their belief that they've proved that fat is bad.
So do you feel like you're a lonely voice within your field, or is there a group that's coalesced of colleagues?
Actually, I'm very excited to report that I'm just one small voice in a big field.
Mm-hmm.
That throughout all of the disciplines, there are experts that are now promoting health at every size.
Okay.
There's even a really wonderful organization called ASDA, the Association for Size Diversity and Health, which is a professional association for people that endorse the health at every size model. And it includes nutritionists and researchers and physiologists and lawyers and fitness trainers and on and on and on, people across many, many disciplines that have all come to the same conclusion, that this weight-based paradigm just isn't working, it's not scientifically supported, and that we will do much better when we start to take the emphasis off of weight and put it on other things that are much more important and manageable. So I think that there's a big counterculture that is developing right now.
With the concept of stop the war.
Exactly.
Okay.
Stop the war against obesity.
Okay.
And in fact, we envision health at every size as the new peace movement that's happening.
Okay.
So,
all right. So you've given us this very provocative framework. For many of us, maybe this is the first time we've really been exposed to these ideas. And so, take us through this. What are the implications for us in our practice, whether we're working with people who have difficulties with food, whether eating disorders seems to be a clinical specialty has a number of important issues that are somewhat different than simply weight loss. But what is it that you want to, in addressing this particular audience, what is it in terms of our professional lives and our everyday practice? What are the things that you think are really important that you would like to communicate to this group?
Okay. Well, in terms of clinical practice, actually working with individuals, I think that there's three important notions that are really helpful to understand and support in your clients. And I'll walk you through each of them. One is about encouraging self-acceptance instead of encouraging and supporting people in trying to change their bodies. And the next is looking at how people view activity instead of looking at it as a means of changing their weight or punishment for weighing too much, to learn how to support people in developing pleasurable habits. And then the third is to help support people who are struggling with food in developing nourishing eating habits. But the key point in Health at Every Size is that health at every size is weight neutral. We don't have an idea that weight loss is good or bad. It's not a goal. It may be a side effect of improved health behaviors, or it may not be. But the idea is always to take the emphasis off of weight and to put it more on the behaviors. And there are a couple of things that I think are really valuable for therapists in looking at this. Probably the first step is to make sure to maintain weight neutrality in addressing their clients. For example, you can't look at a fatter person and assume that they have bad eating habits. There are a lot of fatter people that do have great eating habits, and likewise there are a lot of thin people that are struggling with eating concerns. And so we need to let the client's story tell itself as opposed to making our own assumptions. We also can't make assumptions that people like or don't like their body based on what we're seeing. Like, for example, there are many, many thinner people that feel very dissatisfied. They may feel too fat or they may feel too thin. And we can't look at someone and know whether or not they're concerned about their weight. The next suggestion I have is to think about what recommendations we give to clients. That, for example, we often recommend to heavier clients that restrictive eating habits are good and helpful and beneficial, whereas that same behavior in a thinner client we would see as pathological. So the key point is, again, not make assumptions and to recognize that everybody can benefit from the same nourishing health habits. It doesn't matter whether they're fat or thin. The last point that I have on this slide is to really help clients to transform their own ideas so that they see that the issue in whether or not they're worthy in the world is not about how big or small they are, but it's about how well they take care of themselves and love themselves.
So here's the big question. So the client wants to lose weight and perhaps coming to the therapist thinking that the therapist will help them lose weight in some way. So what is it that we do with that? How literally do we take that request? Where do we go with that?
Well, first, I think it's really important to have compassion for that. That, of course, a lot of people want to lose weight in this culture that's so weight-obsessed, and where there are actual benefits you get for being thinner. You do get a lot more social approval. You do get more job opportunity. So certainly there's a lot of cultural advantages to being thinner. So it's not surprising that clients would have that drive. But given how little control we actually have over our weight, and that a focus on weight just seems so invaluable, what we find is that it's very helpful to help the client to reframe it. That when they're looking to lose weight, there's something that underlies their goal. There's a reason why they want to lose weight. And to help the client decode what that reason might be. For example, it might be that they feel like it's going to make them more attractive in the world. Or it might be that they feel like it's going to make them healthier. And first we have to start with what are their goals? What are they trying to do? And then we can help them in going after those goals much more directly rather than using weight as a mediator. So for example, if they think that they're going to be more attractive being thinner, then we can support them in becoming a more attractive person, in whether it's about showing more sensitivity to other people or whatever it might be for that person that is going to help them to be a better person in the world, as opposed to trying to get at being seen as more attractive through weight. Because what we find is that while there may be a temporary feeling of being more attractive when you do lose weight, that first off, the odds are pretty good that you're going to regain the weight. But even for people that maintain that weight loss over time, what they find is that there's actually a real hollowness towards knowing that people are appreciating them primarily because they're thin. That it didn't really give them the happiness that they were hoping to achieve through getting more of a culturally acceptable body.
So here's the tricky part. So you do the exploration with your client, and in some ways, it's a countercultural exploration because we're bombarded with messages that equate thinness with happiness, certainly attractiveness, and, as you're saying, good health. We give them information that might be challenging, as you've given all of us in this very interesting presentation of yours, and they still want our help in losing weight. So what's the therapist's role in that kind of situation? Do you move into at what point do you once you've tried to broaden the client's perspective and the client decides they've listened to what you say, perhaps respectfully or not, and they still insist on the priority of their own goal. They just want to lose some weight. What do you, in your view, what's the therapist's role?
Well, again, I think it really comes back to having compassion. I certainly understand that drive to lose weight. There is so much benefit we get in our culture from being in thinner bodies. But supporting somebody in that is not in their best interests. That it's a very superficial way of people trying to get some sense of contentment or satisfaction in the world that's not lasting. So if we do give in and support them in trying to lose weight, what we find is actually undermine their self-efficacy. So instead, I think it's always just really important to keep coming back to just how difficult that might be. Let me see if I think my next slide is, so if somebody is heavy, one of the biggest things that you can do is you can show compassion for how difficult it is to live in a culturally stigmatized body and give them support for understanding why they would want to lose weight and recognizing that this isn't a fair world that we live in. But just like we wouldn't support if an African American client was experiencing discrimination, we wouldn't support them in trying to bleach their skin to avoid the discrimination. Instead, we would help them to understand that it's not fair, that they deserve better. And we would help them to develop their defenses against a world that's not so respectful and give them tools to make peace with themselves despite the fact that they don't get all of the cultural reflection that they would like. And what we find is that, sorry, I got a little confused about where my slides were, is that there are a lot of resources out there that can help support people in being in the bodies that they have. Whether it's about finding other role models, searching out the magazines and books where you see larger characters who might reflect their world a little bit better, whether it's about going to museums and seeing artist portrayals through the generations of larger bodies and sexy, beautiful poses. But there are a lot of resources out there to help clients see that their bodies are okay just the way they are, that they're sexy and that they can be sexy and attractive. And there are a lot of skills that people can develop to make more peace with their body, rather than feeling like the only way out of this situation is to leave the stigmatized group by becoming thinner. There are a lot of other options that can help people to just become more comfortable. And ironically, what we find is that the more people are accepting of their bodies, the easier it is to make better choices that respect their bodies. That when people start from a place of self-acceptance, that it allows them to choose foods that are more enjoyable and nourishing. But if you see your body as bad, you're not going to want to take as good care of it.
just as you're saying this, one of the things I remember coming across a study that was quite a remarkable study, got a fair amount of attention a year or so ago. One of the best predictors of people's either weight gain or weight loss was the weight gain or weight loss within their friendship network, not necessarily their family network, but the people who they felt emotionally close with within the world. Is this ringing a bell? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I read the study, and I actually was quite unimpressed with the study.
In the sense of?
Well, the interpretations that were laid on it were basically that fat is contagious, and it seemed to invoke a lot of fear around being around larger people. But I do think that it should be a no-brainer to us that people tend to surround themselves with other people that are like them, that it feels safer when you see yourself reflected back in your friends.
Sure.
So it's not surprising to me that heavier people have heavier people in their social networks.
And so, to me, it seemed that this process of a kind of, I don't know if it's contagious, but it's sort of the nature of human beings, the social comparison process. So as you're talking about therapists and resources, is it do you have anything specific? Because the idea of a therapist chatting with a single client, I think increasingly it's clear that some of the ways in which we deliver our services don't necessarily have maximum impact. And particularly, if somebody's dealing with weight issues, you have the whole culture out there that's communicating a certain message. So are there some resources that you might point therapists towards of helping clients who are struggling to change their attitudes about health and perhaps fitness that would be of use in doing the kind of work that you're recommending here? We're challenging some of the assumptions that people bring into their therapists about weight loss.
Right, absolutely. There are many resources. One thing that I would recommend is there is something called the Health at Every Size Community Resources, www.hacecommunity.org. And there are numerous resources. Like, for example, therapists can put their name in a registry there to let people know that they're HACE sensitive, and clients can do searches to come up with HACE sensitive therapists in their area. There's also a resource list of all kinds of books and clinics and DVDs and fitness professionals, etc. So I think that is one really wonderful resource that can be valuable to people. The Association for Size Diversity in Health also has a lot of resources on their website and can help people connect professionally as well. So those are the main areas. And I've actually written a book on this topic. The book is called Health at Every Size, The Surprising Truth About Your Weight. And the first half of the book basically debunks all of the weight myths and gives all the scientific details for why it's so valuable for us to transform the paradigm. And the second half of the book is a how-to manual that supports people in actually incorporating this in their lives. So it supports people in how to make nourishing food choices, for example, and how to find exercise that's enjoyable, that you're going to want to keep up. So there are a lot of resources, and actually I just found a slide that I've put up here that lists the ones that I just mentioned. There is incredible community and opportunity that's out there. And I also want to recommend the book by one of your formal interviewees that I've read, Judith Matz. She's provided a guidebook for clients on how to kick the diet habit, and she also has a book that she's written for therapists in how to incorporate this. So there are a lot of resources. There are many, many more books that I could recommend, but if you go to the HACE Community Resources, you'd find them. And also, if you go to the back of my book, you'll find all of those resources. And if you go to my book's website, which is hacebook.com, you'll also find that there are a lot of free excerpts and educational materials on the website that can help to educate people. So, for example, you can find a short 3-page handout for therapists on how to incorporate HACE principles into your practice. And you can also find a lot of information to educate other professionals, like fitness professionals or doctors, in how they can look at the paradigm in a new way. And, of course, there's also a lot of free materials there to support clients who are struggling with their own weight concerns.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, and so there's this concept about eating intuitively and really living intuitively and being able to trust oneself in a different way than most of us perhaps have been brought up to regard ourselves. Seems to be really central to a kind of a worldview that's at the heart of this health at every size movement and a number of movements in the both physical health and mental health field. Talk to us a little bit about living and eating intuitively.
Okay. The big premise behind that is that we have all of the expertise we need packaged inside us to be able to make good health choices that are going to keep us healthy and happy. And it's a matter of trusting that. In the nutrition world, I know that people have tried to take this away from us, that we have all of these experts that are telling us what we're supposed to eat or how much we're supposed to eat.
Do's and don'ts, yeah.
Exactly. And what we find is that that's not valuable, that it gets people away from a real felt sense of what really is going to work for them. So, for example, in the nutrition world, there's this belief system that high-fiber diets are good for you. And there's an extraordinary amount of science that supports that, and I do agree that it's true. But if you tell people to eat a high-fiber diet because it's good for them, then what happens is they end up putting foods into good and bad categories. You know, these are the foods I'm supposed to eat, these are the bad foods because they don't have any fiber, and it takes the enjoyment out of eating, and it also gets them away from a real felt sense of why fiber might be valuable. But from a health at every size perspective, instead what we do is we just encourage people to find foods that help them to feel good and eat amounts that help them to feel good. And what people find is that the more they understand nutrition and how their body works and how to read their bodies, is that when they have a low-fiber diet, they probably feel pretty lousy. That oftentimes when people have low-fiber diets, they're very constipated and they might have a lot of energy swings throughout the day. And the more that they get higher fiber foods, the more consistent their energy might be and the easier it is to have bowel movements. And so what people realize is that it just makes me feel better when I have higher fiber foods. I function better during the day. And that becomes a better motivator to eat and to make good choices. And what we also see is that we can get great messages from our body about how much is the right amount. No nutritionist can tell us exactly how many calories are going to be appropriate to maintain our body. But yet our body can be incredibly efficient at giving out all of those messages about when to eat and when to stop eating, the more we become sensitive to its cues. And again, this is something I've written about extensively in my book, helping people to reconnect with all of those cues that are going to support them in enjoying food more and making good choices that help them feel better in their bodies.
Well, we're just about out of time here, Linda. Really, such an interesting and important presentation, and such a very grateful to you for this variety of resources that you can offer to folks. So before we bring this to an end, I just want to again call people's attention to the comment board. There's a link right at the lower part of your screen right now. Just have been so impressed in this webinar and others at the quality of people's contribution and how much these comment boards really contribute to the conversation that begins with the exchange like the one that we had today between Linda and myself. But really the important exchange is the conversation, the ripple effects of this out amongst those of you who are taking this webinar, and even beyond that, how this begins to be applied. So again, I urge you, take a moment and crystallize whatever it is that's stood out for you about Linda's presentation today. If you have questions about this, or you might want to make some links between and maybe take some of these ideas to the next level, go up there now. It's just both for each of us individually, crystallizing, putting our thoughts into language is going to help us hold on to these ideas, these insights, and the importance of these questions more. And at the same time, just being able to call on the collective experience of listening to someone like Linda talk about this subject is something that's deeply enriching. And I wonder, Linda, when this does if you'll be willing to pay a visit to our comment board, as long as you don't need to write an encyclopedia, perhaps look at some of the comments and perhaps give some responses to at least a few of the questions and comments that people make?
I'd be happy to check in. I'd love to support people in going further with Health at Every Size.
Okay, this is great. Thank you so much. It has been a real pleasure talking with you, Linda. Thank you so much. Really eye-opening and really taking us beyond just the purview of psychotherapy and understanding a huge issue in our culture. So thank you so much.